April 29th, 1945, Dachau, Bavaria. The sky above southern Germany hung low and gray, choked with the smoke of a dying regime. The air carried ash, not the ash of combat, but something older, something that clung to the lungs and refused to leave. It was the residue of 12 years of industrial hatred, now drifting across the Bavarian countryside like a shroud that would never fully lift. In the distance, the sound of American artillery had fallen silent. The war in Europe had less than 2 weeks left to run, but for the men of the 45th Infantry Division moving toward the town of Dachau that morning, the hardest revelation of the entire campaign was still ahead. Lieutenant Colonel Felix Sparks led his battalion through the outer perimeter of what the maps identified only as Konzentrationslager Dachau, a concentration camp. The term meant little to most of his men. They had heard rumors, fragments of intelligence reports, whispers from refugees about labor camps and political prisons, but nothing in their training, nothing in 3 years of combat across North Africa, Sicily, Anzio, and France had prepared them for what lay beyond the perimeter fence. As they approached the outer walls, a smell reached them first: decay and human waste, and something chemical, something wrong at a fundamental level. Some of the younger soldiers vomited before they even saw the gates. Then they found the train. 39 boxcars sat motionless on the tracks leading into the camp. The doors were sealed. Sparks ordered them opened. What emerged was not cargo. It was the compressed nightmare of a civilization that had tried to murder its way to utopia. Inside each car were bodies, stacked like cordwood, skeletal remains of human beings who had suffocated or starved during transport. Approximately 2,000 corpses in various states of decomposition, some still bearing the striped uniforms of camp prisoners, some naked, all reduced to bone and sinew. The soldiers stood in silence. There were no orders for this, no doctrine, no protocol in the field manual for confronting the physical manifestation of evil. Private John Lee later wrote, "We had seen dead men before, but these were not soldiers. They were something else, something we didn't have words for." The gates of Dachau opened onto a scene that would fracture the moral certainty of every man who witnessed it. The camp had been in operation since 1933, the first concentration camp established by the Nazi regime, a prototype for all the horrors that followed. Over 12 years, more than 200,000 prisoners had passed through its gates. At least 41,500 had been murdered there, through execution, medical experimentation, starvation, and systematic neglect. But the Americans did not know these numbers yet. They knew only what their eyes showed them: thousands of living skeletons in striped rags, stumbling toward them, weeping, reaching out with hands like claws, speaking in languages the liberators could not understand, but in a desperation that required no translation. In the advancing American troops was a young soldier named Howard Buchner, a medical officer who would later document what he saw. He described prisoners so emaciated that their skin had become translucent, revealing the skeletal architecture beneath. He described children whose growth had been stunted by starvation, whose eyes held something ancient and broken. He described barracks designed to hold 200 men, now containing over 1,000, stacked in bunks like human filing cabinets, the living and the dead intermixed because there was no longer strength to separate them. And in the midst of this revelation, standing beside the barracks and guard towers, were the SS guards. Approximately 50 of them had remained at their posts as the Americans arrived, some still in uniform, some attempting to blend in with the prisoners by donning camp clothing. The Waffen-SS had run Dachau with bureaucratic precision for over a decade. They had processed the arrivals, administered the executions, maintained the records, and collected the belongings of the dead. They had done this not in the chaos of battle, but in the routine of shift work, clocking in and out, taking lunch breaks, going home to their families in the nearby town. What happened next would become one of the most controversial incidents of the European theater, an event that would be investigated, documented, suppressed, and debated for decades. It would raise questions about justice and vengeance, about the moment when liberators became executioners, and about the terrible moral calculus of men pushed beyond the boundaries of their own humanity. And at the center of it all, arriving at Dachau in the hours after the liberation, would be General George S. Patton, a man whose understanding of war was about to collide with something war could not explain. The execution, or executions, for there were several separate incidents, occurred in the hours immediately following the camp's liberation. The exact sequence of events remains disputed, but the essential facts are documented through military investigations, eyewitness testimonies, and Patton's own records. At the coal yard near the camp's southwestern perimeter, a group of SS guards, somewhere between 30 and 50 men, were lined up against a wall. American soldiers, primarily from I Company of the 157th Infantry Regiment, opened fire with rifles and a .30 caliber machine gun. The shooting was not a firefight, it was an execution. Some guards fell immediately, others attempted to flee and were shot in the back. A few survived by hiding beneath the bodies of their comrades. The entire incident lasted perhaps 2 minutes. A similar event occurred near the camp's main entrance, where additional SS guards were shot after surrendering. The prisoners witnessing this took their own revenge. Some acquired weapons from the Americans or fashioned crude implements from camp materials. They descended on the remaining guards with 13 years of accumulated rage. The Americans did not stop them. Some actively facilitated it, handing over suspected guards and collaborators to the prisoners' justice. The camp descended into chaos, not the chaos of combat, but the chaos of reckoning. By the time the shooting stopped, estimates suggest that between 50 and 75 SS guards had been killed, some by American soldiers, some by liberated prisoners, most by a combination of both, in circumstances that blurred the line between execution and mob violence. The bodies were left where they fell, scattered across the coal yard and the assembly grounds, physical punctuation to the moral collapse that had occurred. Lieutenant Colonel Sparks attempted to restore order. He fired his pistol into the air, shouted commands, physically restrained some of his own men. He was, by all accounts, horrified by what was happening, not because he felt sympathy for the SS guards, but because he recognized that his soldiers were crossing a line from which there might be no return. He would later testify, "I was not in control. The camp was not in control. Something else was in control." Reports of the incident reached headquarters within hours. The chain of command that would carry this information upward included Major General Robert Frederick, commander of the 45th Infantry Division, Lieutenant General Wade Hyslop, commander of the XV Corps, and ultimately General George S. Patton, commander of the Third Army, the formation responsible for the liberation of southern Bavaria. Patton received the initial report on April 30th, 1945, the day after the liberation. The message was brief. Irregularities at Dachau, American troops involved in execution of surrendered enemy personnel, investigation recommended. George Patton was 59 years old that spring, a career soldier who had spent 4 decades preparing for the war he had just helped win. He believed in discipline, in military tradition, in the clear hierarchies of command, and the absolute necessity of order. He also believed in killing the enemy with maximum efficiency and minimum sentimentality. His Third Army had driven across France, shattered the German counteroffensive at the Bulge, and raced deep into the heart of the Reich with a speed and aggression that made him both celebrated and controversial. He did not tolerate insubordination. He did not excuse breaches of military law. He had famously slapped 2 soldiers suffering from combat fatigue in Sicily, an incident that nearly ended his career and taught him nothing about the psychological limits of men under extreme stress. But Patton had also seen the camps, not just Dachau, but Ohrdruf, which he had visited a few weeks earlier with General Eisenhower and General Bradley. He had walked through the barracks, seen the ovens, smelled the death. He had ordered the citizens of the nearby German towns to tour the camps, to witness what their silence had enabled. He vomited behind one of the buildings, not from physical weakness, but from the confrontation with something his experience could not accommodate. He wrote in his diary, It is beyond belief. One could not imagine such cruelty. And now his own soldiers had responded to that cruelty with executions that violated the laws of land warfare, the Geneva Conventions, and every principle of military justice. They had shot surrendered prisoners. They had participated in mob violence. They had become, in that moment, something other than the disciplined army he commanded. The question before Patton was not whether a crime had been committed. The evidence was overwhelming. The question was what to do about it.
Patton arrived at Dachau on May 3, 1945, 4 days after the liberation. He came not to inspect the camp. He had no desire to walk again through that gallery of atrocities, but to assess the situation with his division commanders and to determine the appropriate response. The meeting took place in a commandeered building outside the camp perimeter. Present were Major General Frederick, Lieutenant Colonel Sparks, and several staff officers responsible for investigating the incident. The tone was formal, the atmosphere tense. Patton listened to the initial reports in silence. The facts, as presented, were damning. Eyewitnesses, including American soldiers and war correspondents, confirmed that executions had occurred. Photographic evidence existed. Images of dead SS guards lined against walls, bodies in piles, prisoners standing over German corpses with improvised weapons. The legal case was clear. American soldiers under Frederick's command had violated the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Courts-martial would be appropriate. Careers would end. The reputation of the 45th Infantry Division, one of the most distinguished units in the European theater, would be permanently stained. Patton asked a single question. What did these men see before they started shooting? The question was not rhetorical. It was operational. Patton understood war as a system of causes and effects, of actions taken under specific conditions. He demanded that Frederick and Sparks walk him through the timeline, not of the executions, but of the liberation. He wanted to know what his soldiers had encountered in the moments before they opened fire. The officers complied. They described the train cars. They described the condition of the prisoners. They described the barracks where the dead and dying lay stacked in tiers, where the floors were slick with human waste, where the smell alone was enough to break men. They described how some soldiers, witnessing this, had simply collapsed, unable to process what they were seeing, how others had wept openly, men who had survived Anzio and the Gothic Line, reduced to tears by a spectacle that transcended combat, how the youngest among them, the replacements who had joined the division only weeks earlier, stood in shock, their training and their understanding of the world rendered suddenly obsolete. And they described the SS guards, standing beside this nightmare in clean uniforms, uninjured, well-fed, carrying the keys to the barracks and the records of the dead. Patton listened without interruption. When the briefing concluded, he stood and walked to the window. Outside, the late afternoon sun illuminated the Bavarian countryside, the rolling fields and distant mountains that had witnessed 12 years of systematic murder. He remained silent for nearly a minute. Then he turned back to the assembled officers and delivered his judgment. "Gentlemen," he said, "there will be no courts-martial." The room remained silent. Patton continued. "What happened here was not war. It was something else. Something outside the boundaries of what we are trained to confront. My men are soldiers, not philosophers. They are trained to fight and to kill according to the rules we have established. But we have no rules for what they found here. We have no training for encountering hell itself. These guards were part of that hell. They wore the uniform of the Wehrmacht, and by the strict letter of the law, they were entitled to the protections of surrender. But the letter of the law was written for war, and this was not war. This was the opposite of war. War has rules. This had none." He paused, then added, "If we prosecute these men, we are saying that they should have maintained perfect discipline in the face of the worst thing human beings have ever created. We are saying that they should have done the paperwork, processed the prisoners, filed the reports, while surrounded by evidence that the very concept of law had been murdered here long before we arrived. I will not ask that of them. I will not punish them for being human in a place designed to destroy humanity." The decision was made. There would be no official investigation, no charges filed, no courts-martial convened. The incident at Dachau would be documented. The army could not pretend it had not occurred, but it would not be prosecuted. Patton ordered that the written reports be amended to reflect combat conditions and ongoing enemy resistance, language vague enough to provide legal cover without explicitly lying. He instructed his staff officers to ensure that all involved soldiers received appropriate counseling and that the incident be treated as classified to prevent press coverage that might undermine morale or provide propaganda to those who wished to draw moral equivalence between Allied forces and the Nazi regime. But Patton also understood that his decision carried risks. He was setting a precedent, creating a space where military justice could be suspended based on emotional circumstances. He was, in effect, acknowledging that there were situations where the normal rules did not apply, where men could kill surrendered enemies and face no consequences. This was dangerous territory, the edge of a slope that led towards the very brutality he was fighting against. To mitigate this, he issued additional orders. Every soldier in the Third Army would attend mandatory briefings on the laws of war and the treatment of prisoners. Any future incident involving the execution of surrendered enemy personnel would be prosecuted to the fullest extent of military law. The exception he was granting for Dachau was precisely that, an exception, not a new policy. It was a recognition that extraordinary circumstances could produce actions that, while technically illegal, were understandable within their context. He concluded the meeting with a final observation. The difference between us and them is not that we never do wrong. The difference is that when we do wrong, we know it, we feel it, we struggle with it. That struggle is what makes us human. The men who shot those guards are struggling now. They will struggle for the rest of their lives. That is their punishment, and it is sufficient. The suppression of the Dachau incident was not absolute. Investigations continued at various levels of command, prompted by concerns among some officers that allowing such actions to go unpunished would set a dangerous precedent. In August 1945, 3 months after the German surrender, Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Whittaker of the Judge Advocate General's Corps completed a comprehensive review of the events at Dachau. His report, running to over 100 pages, documented the executions in detail and concluded that violations of the laws of war had indeed occurred. He recommended that charges be brought against Lieutenant Colonel Sparks and other officers who had failed to prevent or halt the killings. The report reached the desk of Lieutenant General Lucian Truscott, who had replaced Patton as commander of the Third Army after Patton's controversial statements about post-war governance led to his reassignment. Truscott reviewed the Whittaker report, consulted with Eisenhower's headquarters, and issued his own conclusion. No action would be taken. He cited the extraordinary circumstances of the liberation, the psychological impact on American forces, and the practical difficulty of securing convictions from military juries who would themselves have been exposed to similar horrors. The Whittaker report was classified and filed away, where it would remain for decades. But Patton himself never moved past Dachau. His diary entries from May 1945 reveal a man struggling to reconcile what he had authorized with what he believed about military discipline and moral order. He wrote, "I have commanded men in battle for 4 years. I have ordered them to kill, and they have obeyed. But what I saw at that camp was not the enemy. It was the death of the idea that there are limits. If we lose that idea, if we accept that anything is possible when we are angry or shocked or righteous, then we become the thing we are fighting."
Yet he did not reverse his decision. He did not order prosecutions or reopen investigations. He held firm to the judgment he had made in that commandeered building outside Dachau, that his soldiers had encountered something beyond the scope of military law, and that to punish them for their response would be to demand an inhuman level of detachment in the face of inhuman evil. The tension between these positions, the recognition that wrong had been done and the refusal to prosecute that wrong, would define Patton's final months. He understood that he had created a legal and moral ambiguity, a space where the rules he spent his life enforcing had been suspended. He understood that this decision could be used to justify future atrocities, that it could be twisted into a permission structure for revenge killings and extrajudicial executions,
and he understood that he could not undo it without betraying the men who had seen what he had seen and responded as humans, not as machines. The broader implications of Patton's decision extend far beyond the specific incident at Dachau. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, Allied forces faced hundreds of similar situations across Germany and the liberated territories. Soviet forces, encountering the camps in the east, responded with systematic executions of SS personnel that dwarfed the Dachau incident. British and French units reported similar breakdowns in discipline when confronted with evidence of Nazi atrocities. The difference was that the American military, with its emphasis on legal process and public accountability, struggled more visibly with the contradiction between justice and vengeance. Patton's solution, to acknowledge wrongdoing while refusing to prosecute, created a template that would recur throughout the post-war period. At the Nuremberg trials, Allied prosecutors faced the challenge of condemning Nazi war crimes while defending actions like the strategic bombing of civilian targets and the use of atomic weapons on Japanese cities. The legal arguments employed at Nuremberg rested on the concept of crimes against humanity, a category of offense so severe that it transcended normal military conduct and demanded extraordinary judicial response. But this logic, if applied consistently, would have implicated Allied actions as well, not at the scale or with the systematic intent of Nazi crimes, but actions that nonetheless involved the deliberate killing of non-combatants. Patton understood this inconsistency, and it troubled him. He was not a philosopher, but he was a student of military history, and he recognized that wars create their own morality, a temporary suspension of peacetime ethics that allows for killing and destruction but demands that such violence remain bounded by rules. The Holocaust represented the total abandonment of those boundaries, the replacement of war with something else, industrial genocide conducted with bureaucratic efficiency. And Dachau, as the prototype and symbol of that system, confronted American soldiers with evidence that the rules they believed in had already been violated on a scale they could not comprehend. Patton's refusal to prosecute the Dachau executions was, in this light, an acknowledgement that some encounters exceed the capacity of law to provide meaningful resolution. It was not a declaration that law did not matter, but rather that law, like all human institutions, has limits. Beyond those limits lie situations where judgment must rely on something other than legal precedent, on empathy, on historical context, on an understanding of human breaking points. This was not a comfortable position for Patton to occupy. He had spent his career within the rigid hierarchies of military discipline, where orders were absolute and consequences were clear. To admit that circumstances could alter those absolutes was to admit vulnerability, uncertainty, the possibility that the structures he trusted might fail in the face of sufficient horror, and Dachau was, by any measure, sufficient. The soldiers who participated in the executions at Dachau carried the weight of that day for the rest of their lives. Some spoke openly about it in later years, framing their actions as justified responses to unimaginable atrocity. Others refused to discuss it at all, the memory too painful or too complicated to articulate. Lieutenant Colonel Sparks, who attempted to stop the killings and spent decades defending his men from criticism, described the incident as the moment we realized we were no longer just fighting a war, we were witnessing the death of the world we thought we knew. For Patton, the burden was different. He did not pull the triggers at Dachau, but his decision not to prosecute those who did made him responsible in a way that command always makes one responsible. He had chosen to protect his soldiers from the consequences of their actions, and in doing so, he had taken upon himself the moral ambiguity of that choice. He could not claim innocence because he had actively intervened to prevent justice, or what the law defined as justice, from taking its course, and he could not claim righteousness because he knew that what his soldiers had done was wrong by the standards he had enforced throughout his career. The only position left to him was acknowledgement, to say, "This happened, it was wrong, and I understand why it happened, and I will not punish it, and that decision is mine to carry." It was a burden Patton carried in silence, visible only in the pages of his diary and in the testimony of those who met with him in the weeks after Dachau. General Omar Bradley, who had known Patton for decades, later recalled that his old colleague seemed diminished after the camp liberations, as if some essential certainty had been extracted from him. Patton died in December 1945, 7 months after the end of the war in Europe, from injuries sustained in a car accident in Germany. He never returned to the United States. He never faced public questioning about Dachau or his decision not to prosecute the executions there. The controversy remained largely hidden until the 1970s, when declassified documents and investigative journalism brought the incident back into public consciousness. By then, most of the participants were elderly or deceased, and the debates that followed were conducted by people who had not witnessed what happened in those boxcars or behind that wire. There is a photograph taken at Dachau on the day of liberation that has come to symbolize the mortal complexity of that moment. It shows an American soldier, young and exhausted, standing beside a pile of emaciated corpses. In one hand, he holds his rifle. With the other, he covers his face. The gesture is ambiguous. It could be grief or horror or shame or simply the physical necessity of blocking out a smell too overwhelming to bear. The photograph offers no answers. It simply presents a human being confronting something human beings were never meant to create. Patton saw that photograph, or others like it. He saw his soldiers transformed by what they had witnessed, saw them struggle to reconcile their training with the reality of Dachau, and he made the choice to protect them from the machinery of military justice, not because he believed they were innocent, but because he believed that the circumstances had destroyed the framework within which guilt and innocence could be meaningfully assessed. He was not condoning murder. He was acknowledging that murder, as a legal category, could not contain what had occurred at Dachau, neither the 12 years of systematic killing by the SS, nor the 2 minutes of rage by American soldiers who had seen the evidence of those years. This is the terrible knowledge that Patton carried away from Dachau, that there are situations where all choices are wrong, where every action and inaction carries moral weight that cannot be resolved through law or procedure or command decisions. The Geneva Conventions could not account for the Holocaust. Military justice could not account for the psychological destruction of men confronted with genocide, and no amount of discipline or training could prepare soldiers to maintain perfect restraint when faced with the architects of Dachau standing well-fed and uniformed beside the evidence of their work. Patton's refusal to prosecute the Dachau executions was not a solution. It was a recognition that there was no solution, only a choice between imperfect responses to an event that had shattered the categories through which such events are normally understood. He chose to prioritize his soldiers' humanity over strict legal accountability, and in doing so, he accepted responsibility for the consequences of that choice. It was an act of command, but also an act of empathy. A recognition that his men had been broken by what they saw, and that breaking them further through court-martials would serve no purpose beyond satisfying the abstract demands of military law.
The sun set over Dachau on the evening of May 3, 1945, as it had set every evening for 12 years of the camp's operation. The smoke no longer rose from the crematorium. The guard tower stood empty. The gates, which had admitted more than 200,000 prisoners and released only the dead, now stood open. American medics worked through the night, trying to save prisoners whose bodies had been so depleted by starvation that even liberation came too late. Hundreds would die in the days following the camp's liberation, their systems too damaged to recover despite the availability of food and medicine. General Patton did not remain at Dachau to witness the ongoing rescue efforts. He returned to his headquarters, where the war's final tasks awaited him: the occupation of Bavaria, the disarmament of remaining German forces, the beginning of the complex and bitter process of post-war administration. But Dachau remained with him, as it remained with every soldier who had entered those gates. The camp became a reference point, a measure of extremity against which all other wartime experiences were calibrated and found inadequate. In the decades that followed, historians and ethicists have debated Patton's decision from every angle. Some argued that he enabled a war crime,
that his refusal to prosecute the Dachau executions set a precedent for future atrocities and undermined the principles the Allies claimed to be fighting for. Others contend that he demonstrated wisdom and mercy, recognizing that his soldiers had been pushed beyond any reasonable limit and that punishing them would compound tragedy with injustice. Both positions contain truth. Both are insufficient. The real lesson of Patton's choice is not about whether he was right or wrong, but about the limits of moral certainty in the face of absolute evil. Dachau was designed to break human beings, to reduce prisoners to numbers, to transform murder into bureaucracy, to prove that civilization was a thin membrane easily punctured by those willing to discard it. And it succeeded. But its success extended beyond the prisoners it killed. It broke the liberators as well, not in the same way or to the same degree, but broken nonetheless, forced to confront evidence that the world contained depths of cruelty they had not imagined possible, and forced to choose how to respond with tools and training designed for conventional warfare. Patton understood that his soldiers' response, however illegal, was fundamentally different from the actions of the SS guards they had executed. The Americans had killed in rage and horror in the immediate aftermath of encountering genocide. The SS had killed systematically, dispassionately, over years as a matter of policy and routine. The moral equivalence some drew between these acts collapsed under examination. And yet, murder remained murder. The law recognized no exception for righteous anger or psychological trauma. The law said, these men killed surrendered prisoners and they must be prosecuted. Patton chose humanity over law. It was not a choice he made lightly, and it was not a choice he believed should become policy. It was a specific response to a specific situation, an acknowledgement that sometimes, rarely, but sometimes, the rules we create to govern ourselves encounter situations they cannot accommodate. And in those moments, judgment must rely not on procedure, but on understanding, not on precedent, but on recognition of human limits. There is a final detail, recorded in Patton's diary but rarely discussed in histories of the incident. After his meeting with Frederick and Sparks, after delivering his decision not to prosecute, Patton requested that he be driven alone to the outskirts of Dachau. He asked his driver to wait, and he walked to a small clearing where he could see the camp in the distance, the barracks and towers silhouetted against the darkening sky. He stood there for nearly an hour, unmoving, watching as the last light faded from the day of his most difficult command decision. What he thought during that hour is unknown. The diary entry that night is brief. Did what I could, not sure it was enough, not sure anything would be. It is the confession of a man who understood that he had been presented with a problem that had no good solution, only various gradations of inadequacy. He had protected his soldiers from prosecution, but he could not protect them from the memory of what they had done, or the knowledge that they had crossed a line. He had upheld military cohesion and morale, but he had compromised the principles of military justice. He had acted with mercy, but mercy itself could be a form of moral evasion, a way of avoiding the hard work of judgment. George Patton was many things, brilliant and brutal, visionary and vain, a warrior who loved battle and a scholar who understood its costs. But standing beside Dachau on that May evening, he was simply a commander who had encountered the limit of what command could accomplish. He had given orders and made decisions through 4 years of war, had shaped the movements of armies and the fates of thousands, but he could not order his soldiers to unsee what they had seen. He could not command away the psychological destruction that Dachau had inflicted on his men, and he could not resolve through any act of will or military authority the terrible contradiction between the justice his soldiers deserved and the justice the SS guards would never receive. So he did the only thing left to him. He made a choice, accepted responsibility for it, and carried the weight of that choice forward. It was the essence of command, not the glory of victory or the clarity of strategy, but the burden of deciding when rules applied and when circumstances exceeded them. It was the work of leadership in the face of events that shattered leadership's usual categories. And in the end, it was an acknowledgement that war, even a war as just and necessary as the struggle against Nazi Germany, destroys more than buildings and bodies. It destroys certainties. It destroys the comforting fiction that right and wrong are always distinguishable, that good people never do terrible things, that justice and mercy can always be reconciled. Dachau destroyed those fictions for everyone who entered its gates, liberators alike. And Patton, standing in the fading light of a German spring, understood that no order he could give would restore what Dachau had taken from his men. The war ended 8 days later. The Third Army went home. The gates of Dachau were named open, a monument to what human beings are capable of when they abandon the constraints of civilization. And buried in the classified files of the U.S. Army, the reports of what happened in the coal yard and at the main gate remained hidden, a reminder that even in the most just war, even in the act of liberation itself, human beings confronted with absolute evil may respond with actions that law cannot accommodate and history cannot easily judge. Patton's decision stands as evidence not of American moral superiority, but of something more modest and more profound, the recognition that soldiers are human, that humanity has limits, and that those limits, when reached, require understanding rather than punishment. It was not justice, it was mercy, and perhaps, in a place like Dachau, mercy was the only form of justice that remained possible.